Charles Whitman. On a hot Texas morning in August 1966, the University of Texas at Austin stood beneath a cloudless sky. Students shuffled between classes, the sound of laughter and footsteps echoing against the limestone buildings. No one could have imagined that by midday, the campus would become the scene of one of the most horrifying acts of violence in American history. The man behind it was Charles Joseph Whitman, a 25-year-old former Marine, engineering student, and husband, who would be remembered not for his medals or his intelligence, but as the Texas Tower Sniper. His descent into madness began long before he carried rifles and ammunition to the top of the UT Clock Tower. Born on June 24, 1941, in Lake Worth, Florida, Whitman grew up in a house ruled by fear. His father, Charles Sr., was a self-made man with a temper as violent as his fists. He demanded perfection from his wife and 3 sons, beating them for even the smallest mistakes. His mother, Margaret, was devoutly Catholic and tried to protect her children, but she herself was a victim of constant abuse. Neighbors often called the police, but nothing ever changed. Outwardly, Charles was the golden boy, intelligent, polite, with an IQ of 139. He was the youngest Eagle Scout in the country at age 12, a gifted pianist, and an expert marksman thanks to his father's obsession with firearms. Yet, behind the quiet smile and church attendance, something darker was taking shape. Discipline was drilled into him with violence, and emotion was a weakness that had no place in the Whitman household. After graduating from high school in 1959, Charles enlisted in the Marines, partly to escape his father, partly to prove himself. At first, he excelled. He earned a sharpshooter's badge, was known for his precision in long-distance shooting, and received a scholarship to study engineering at the University of Texas. But the promising future didn't last. Charles's life began to unravel under the weight of pressure, isolation, and a deepening sense of rage he couldn't explain. His grades slipped, he was caught poaching a deer and fined, and he began gambling, habits that led to a court-martial and a demotion. The military that had once given him purpose now humiliated him. By 1964, discharged from the Marines, he returned to Austin with his young wife, Kathleen Leisner, a kind and ambitious schoolteacher who adored him. They were the picture of a perfect couple, but inside their small home, Whitman battled demons he could not silence. He took jobs as a bank teller, bill collector, and surveyor, trying to rebuild stability. Yet, he wrote in his journals about his violent impulses and his growing fear of becoming like his father. "I despise myself for striking her," he once wrote after hitting Kathy during an argument. "I am mortally afraid of being like him." By 1966, his life spiraled further. His mother finally fled his father's abuse and moved to Austin. Charles helped her escape, afraid his father would kill her. But the stress only made his mental state worse. He began taking amphetamines and complained of excruciating headaches that no doctor could explain. He saw several physicians, even a campus psychiatrist, telling one that he was haunted by violent thoughts. Thinking about going up on the tower with a deer rifle and start shooting people. The psychiatrist noted his hostility, but didn't consider him a threat. No one saw what was coming. On July 31, 1966, the night before the massacre, Whitman sat at his typewriter and began composing a suicide note. His words were chillingly calm. "I don't quite understand what it is that compels me to type this letter. I have been a victim of many unusual and irrational thoughts." He wrote that he wanted an autopsy performed on his brain to determine if something biological was causing his tremendous headaches. But the most horrifying part came next. He had decided to kill his wife and mother. He claimed he loved them both deeply and wanted to relieve them from the suffering of this world. Just after midnight, he drove to his mother's apartment, strangled or stabbed her to death, and left her body neatly on the bed under clean sheets. He left a note saying she was in a better place. Then, he returned home, stabbed his sleeping wife 5 times in the chest, and covered her body just the same. At 5:45 a.m., he called her workplace to report she was too sick to come in. Hours later, he made another call to his mother's job, saying she was ill too. Both women were already dead. Around 11:30 a.m., under the blazing Texas sun, Whitman arrived at the University of Texas. Dressed like a maintenance worker, he pushed a footlocker full of weapons, ammunition, and food through the halls of the main building, telling guards he was delivering research equipment. He took the elevator to the 27th floor, climbed the last flight of stairs, and shot 3 people who got in his way. Then, stepping out onto the observation deck, he began his rampage. From his elevated perch, Whitman's field of vision stretched across campus. With military precision, he began firing at random. Students, professors, and pedestrians below fell one by one. People scrambled for cover as the sharp cracks of the rifle echoed across the grounds. Witnesses recalled the eerie calm between each shot, as if he were hunting rather than attacking. For 96 minutes, the tower became his fortress of death. A pregnant woman was shot in the stomach. Another man died trying to help her. Police officers and armed civilians fired back from the ground, their bullets pinging uselessly against the tower's concrete walls. The heat, the smoke, and the chaos made the scene feel like a battlefield in the middle of a college campus. Finally, 2 Austin police officers, Ramiro Martinez and Houston McCoy, made their way up the tower, flanking the observation deck. Martinez spotted Whitman crouched behind a parapet and fired. McCoy followed with his shotgun. At 1:24 p.m., the shooting stopped. Charles Whitman was dead. 17 people would ultimately lose their lives, and 31 were injured, one victim dying decades later from her wounds. When investigators searched Whitman's home, they found his meticulously typed notes, a to-do list that included buy binoculars, kill mother, kill wife, and go to tower. But they also found desperate pleas for understanding, requests for his brain to be examined, and for his body to be cremated after autopsy. What doctors discovered would only deepen the mystery. During the autopsy, a small pecan-sized tumor was found, pressing against his amygdala, a part of the brain responsible for emotion and aggression. Experts speculated that it might have influenced his violent impulses, but no one could say for sure. Was it the tumor, the drugs, or years of psychological abuse that turned him into a killer? Governor John Connally formed a commission to study the case. After days of review, the panel concluded that the tumor conceivably could have contributed to his inability to control his emotions, but they couldn't definitively explain his actions. Science couldn't solve the riddle of Charles Whitman's mind. The funerals for Charles and his mother were held together in Florida, their caskets draped in flowers and silence. Despite his crimes, Whitman was buried with military honors. The American flag laid gently over his coffin, an image that haunted many who had once called him a hero. In the years that followed, the massacre changed how America saw public safety, police response, and mental health intervention. It was one of the first mass shootings in U.S. history, a grim prelude to a violence that would repeat across generations. For those who survived that day, the sound of gunfire from the Texas Tower never faded. It became part of the nation's collective memory, a reminder of how an intelligent young man, once full of promise, turned his brilliance into horror. And at the heart of it all remains the same haunting question. Was Charles Whitman a monster born, or a man made by his own broken mind? Martin Bryant. It was a crisp autumn morning in Tasmania when the calm of Port Arthur shattered forever. On April 28, 1996, a quiet coastal town known for its haunting convict ruins became the scene of one of the most horrific massacres in modern history. The man who brought this nightmare to life was Martin John Bryant, a pale, lonely figure with a vacant smile and eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. By the end of his rampage, 35 innocent lives were gone, and 23 others were wounded. What led a man like Bryant to such unimaginable violence was not a sudden eruption of madness, but a lifetime of isolation, delusion, and festering resentment that built up like a storm waiting to explode. Born on May 7, 1967, in Hobart, Tasmania, Martin Bryant was a child described by everyone who met him as different. His mother would later recall how he broke toys for no reason, how he would smile when others cried, and how his eyes seemed to light up at chaos. At school, he was violent and disruptive, torturing animals, pulling the snorkel from another boy underwater, and cutting down trees that didn't belong to him. Teachers described him as distant from reality, and psychologists warned that he might one day pose a serious threat. A psychiatrist who examined him told his parents bluntly that Martin would never be able to hold down a job or live independently. When he was just 12, a firework accident landed him in the hospital. Even then, as cameras rolled for a local news segment, he grinned into the lens like a boy who didn't understand pain or fear. As Bryant grew older, his world became smaller. He struggled to read or write, failed at school, and relied completely on his parents. When he turned 19, he met a woman who would change everything. Her name was Helen Harvey, an eccentric, lonely heiress in her 50s who lived with her elderly mother and dozens of cats and dogs in a decaying mansion. When she hired Martin to mow her lawn, something strange clicked between them. The two became inseparable, a bizarre pair driving around Hobart in luxury cars, eating at expensive restaurants, and spending wildly. Neighbors whispered that the relationship was odd, but no one could make sense of it. Martin, who had never been accepted anywhere, finally had someone who treated him as special. But tragedy followed. In 1992, Harvey lost control of her car and slammed into another vehicle. Both she and her dogs were killed instantly. Martin survived, but spent months recovering in the hospital. Police quietly questioned him afterward. There were rumors he had a habit of grabbing the steering wheel when Harvey drove, forcing her into near misses. She had even told neighbors that, one day, the little bastard will kill me. When Harvey's will was read, Martin was the sole beneficiary of her fortune. He suddenly found himself rich, a man with money but no purpose, no guidance, and no friends. He bought a sprawling farm, dressed in flamboyant suits, and roamed the countryside firing his gun at animals and tourists. Locals avoided him. They whispered about the strange young man who drank alone and carried his rifle everywhere he went. Then, in 1993, his father, Maurice, was found dead, floating face down in a dam with a weight belt strapped to his neck. It was ruled a suicide. For Martin, it was another crack in a fragile mind already splintering. He blamed a couple named David and Nolene Martin, who owned a property called Seascape. His father had once wanted to buy that property, and Martin convinced himself that the couple's refusal had destroyed his family and driven his father to his death. By 1996, Bryant was drinking heavily, traveling aimlessly, and telling people he felt invisible. He once said to a neighbor, "I'll do something that will make everyone remember me." On the morning of April 28, 1996, he loaded his bag with weapons, including a Colt AR-15 semi-automatic rifle, and drove his yellow Volvo to Seascape. There, he shot David and Nolene Martin, stealing their weapons and car keys before heading to the Port Arthur Historic Site, a place filled with tourists enjoying a sunny weekend. He paid the entry fee, walked casually into the Broad Arrow Cafe, and ordered lunch. Witnesses would later recall how cheerful he seemed, smiling, chatting about wasps and tourists. When he finished eating, he stood up, walked toward the back of the cafe, and set a video camera on a table. Then he reached into his blue sports bag and pulled out the rifle. Without hesitation, he began firing. In just 15 seconds, he unleashed 17 rounds, killing 12 people and wounding 10. The cafe erupted into chaos. Chairs overturned, screams filled the air, glass shattered. Bryant moved methodically, reloading, shooting again, walking calmly through the carnage as if detached from the horror around him. He shot 8 more people in seconds, then stepped outside to the parking lot and fired at anyone in sight. A woman and her 2 young children were among his next victims. He shot the mother first, then the child in her arms, and when the older daughter tried to run, he chased her down and killed her too. Moments later, he ambushed a car, killing all 4 occupants and stealing their gold BMW. As police scrambled to respond, Bryant continued his rampage down the road, shooting into vehicles and striking random victims. When he finally returned to Seascape, he set the stolen car on fire, dragged a hostage inside, and barricaded himself with the bodies of David and Noeline Martin. For the next 18 hours, he spoke to negotiators over the phone, his tone eerily calm. He demanded an army helicopter and seemed to relish the attention. When the phone battery finally died, the line went silent. The next morning, smoke began to pour from the building. Bryant had set the guest house ablaze. As flames swallowed the structure, he ran outside, his back and legs scorched by the fire, only to be captured by police. 35 people were dead. 23 more were wounded. The massacre sent shockwaves across Australia and the world. It would forever change the nation's gun laws. But inside prison, Martin Bryant showed little understanding of what he had done. During questioning, he smiled and giggled. When asked why he killed so many, he shrugged and said, "A lot of fun, didn't you think?" In court, he initially pleaded not guilty, but later changed his plea to guilty after being persuaded by his lawyer. On November 22, 1996, he was sentenced to 35 life terms, plus over 1,000 years, without the possibility of parole. The harshest sentence in Australian history. He was sent to Risdon Prison, where he has remained ever since. Seung-Hui Cho. On a cool spring morning in April 2007, the campus of Virginia Tech in Blacksburg, Virginia, stirred awake like any other weekday. Students shuffled to class, the air heavy with the familiar rhythm of university life. But that morning would end in unimaginable horror, a massacre that would become one of the deadliest school shootings in American history. At the center of it all stood a young man few truly understood, Seung-Hui Cho. Born in South Korea in 1984, Cho moved to the United States with his family when he was 8. They settled in Virginia, where he grew up shy, quiet, and deeply introverted. Teachers described him as polite but withdrawn, a boy who rarely made eye contact and spoke so softly that others strained to hear him. In middle school, he was diagnosed with severe selective mutism and social anxiety disorder, conditions that made communication nearly impossible. While other kids formed friendships, Cho lived in isolation, his silence often mistaken for arrogance or oddity. As he grew older, his behavior darkened. At Virginia Tech, where he studied English, professors noticed disturbing patterns in his writing, violent themes filled with anger, revenge, and despair. His creative writing instructor, the celebrated poet Nikki Giovanni, once told administrators she would resign if Cho wasn't removed from her class. His classmates feared him. He took photographs of students during lectures without permission, muttered to himself, and often wore sunglasses indoors. To many, he was a shadow that lingered at the edge of every room. Behind closed doors, Cho's mind unraveled further. He wrote stories and plays where he fantasized about death and violence, calling himself ? In videos, where he ranted about being persecuted by rich kids and debauchery. The loneliness that consumed him transformed into hatred. He purchased 2 handguns, a Glock 19 and a Walther P22, both legally. He practiced at a firing range, methodically preparing for something he never revealed to anyone. On April 16, 2007, at approximately 7:15 a.m., the first shots echoed through the halls of West Ambler Johnston Hall, a dormitory where 19-year-old freshman Emily Hilscher and resident assistant Ryan Clark were found fatally wounded. Police arrived quickly, but at first the killing seemed like an isolated domestic incident. The university, uncertain of the shooter's whereabouts, issued only a vague warning. For the next 2 hours, the campus went on as usual. Students headed to morning lectures, unaware that death was walking among them. At around 9:40 a.m., Cho entered Norris Hall, an engineering building. He chained the main doors shut from the inside to prevent escape or intervention. Then, armed and silent, he began his rampage. Within minutes, classrooms turned into slaughterhouses. He methodically moved from room to room, firing at students and professors who had no time to react. Some barricaded doors with their bodies. Others leapt from second-story windows. Professors like Liviu Librescu, a Holocaust survivor, used their own lives to shield their students. Inside room 204, Cho fired dozens of rounds, leaving only a handful alive. He moved with chilling precision, reloading calmly, as if detached from reality. His expression, witnesses later said, was blank. Neither rage nor emotion, just emptiness. The entire massacre lasted about 11 minutes. When police finally breached the chain doors and reached the second floor, Cho was already dead, a single bullet wound through his head. He had turned one of his guns on himself, ending his life at 23. In total, 32 people were murdered and 17 others injured. Investigators pieced together the timeline, stunned by the brutality and planning involved. The days that followed revealed the depth of Cho's descent. Hours before the second wave of killings, he mailed a package to NBC News. Inside were photos, writings, and videos he recorded between the murders. In those clips, Cho stared directly into the camera, his voice cold and detached. "You had 100 billion chances and ways to have avoided today," he said, "but you decided to spill my blood." His words were incoherent, a jumble of resentment and grandiosity. He saw himself as a martyr, a victim of societal rejection, and his victims as representatives of the world that had scorned him. The tapes painted a chilling portrait of a man consumed by delusion. In them, Cho held the camera close, ranting about hypocrisy and loneliness. He wore a vest filled with ammunition, glaring as if he were addressing ghosts. When NBC released parts of the footage, it shocked the nation. It was the face of a killer who believed he was avenging something he could never articulate. Investigations into Cho's past exposed multiple failures, warnings that were ignored, red flags that went unheeded. In 2005, a judge had ruled Cho mentally ill and ordered him to undergo outpatient psychiatric treatment after a stalking incident involving 2 female students. But the follow-up never happened. Bureaucratic gaps allowed him to pass background checks for his firearms. Professors had raised alarms. Campus police had received complaints. Yet Cho slipped through every safety net. His parents were devastated. They had fled Korea to give their children a better life, working long hours at a dry cleaning business. When reporters reached them, they wept uncontrollably, unable to comprehend the monster their son had become. "We are living in a nightmare," his sister said. He was quiet, but we never imagined this. Across the United States, grief turned into outrage. Vigils were held, candles lit, and debates reignited over gun control and mental health reform. The tragedy at Virginia Tech exposed deep flaws in the system, a perfect storm of untreated illness, administrative failures, and easy access to weapons. Survivors carried scars that would never fade. Some spoke of guilt, of hearing the shots, but being unable to save their friends. Others, like those who jumped from windows, spoke of the haunting silence that followed, the eerie stillness after the gunfire stopped, when the only sound was the echo of alarms and distant sobbing. Anders Behring Breivik. On July 22, 2011, Norway awoke to a nightmare it had never known before. It began like any other summer day: bright skies, tourists strolling through Oslo, children laughing in parks. But within hours, the capital would be transformed into a scene of horror and disbelief. At 3:25 p.m., a powerful car bomb exploded outside the government quarter in Oslo, shattering glass, tearing through buildings, and sending shockwaves through the city. 8 people were killed instantly, dozens more were injured, and emergency responders rushed into a chaotic maze of smoke and debris. The air was filled with the sound of sirens, alarms, and terrified screams. It felt like a terrorist attack from abroad, something that didn't belong in peaceful Norway. But the truth would soon prove even darker. While police and emergency services scrambled to secure the capital, a man dressed in a police uniform was already on his way to the next stage of his plan. His name was Anders Behring Breivik. Born in 1979, Breivik grew up in a middle-class Oslo neighborhood. His parents divorced when he was just a year old, and his relationship with both remained distant and strained. As a teenager, he was described as quiet, intelligent, and socially awkward. He sought identity through online gaming and far-right forums, where he began to develop a fascination with nationalism, racial purity, and anti-Islamic rhetoric. Over time, these obsessions hardened into extremist ideology. He saw himself not as a murderer, but as a soldier in a self-declared war to save Europe from multiculturalism. Years before the attack, Breivik meticulously planned every detail. He purchased fertilizer under the guise of farming, collected chemicals, and studied military tactics. In his manifesto, over 1,500 pages long, he outlined his vision of a European resistance and declared that violence was necessary to awaken the continent. He spent years living in isolation, writing, building weapons, and constructing the massive bomb that would tear through Oslo. Yet no one suspected the danger. He was polite to neighbors, paid his bills on time, and moved quietly through life, hiding the monster he was becoming. Only 2 hours after the Oslo bombing, Breivik arrived at Utøya Island, about 25 miles away. The small island was hosting a summer camp organized by the Labour Party's youth wing, filled with teenagers eager to discuss politics and the future of their country. Disguised as a police officer, Breivik told the camp organizers he had been sent to ensure their safety after the explosion in Oslo. Trusting him, they ferried him across to the island. Within minutes, he began shooting. The first victims were those closest to him, the camp security guard, and a young woman who tried to ask for identification. Then, methodically, he moved across the island, reloading his semi-automatic rifle, hunting down terrified children as they ran for their lives. Many tried to hide behind rocks or trees. Others dove into the cold water, attempting to swim to safety. Breivik followed them to the shore, firing at those struggling in the lake. Survivors later described hearing him laugh, calm and deliberate as he killed. For over an hour, he moved from one end of Utøya to the other, executing 69 people, most of them teenagers between 14 and 19. The horror of what happened there would scar Norway forever. When police finally reached the island, Breivik surrendered without resistance. He had prepared for this moment. In his mind, he had already won. He believed that his act of violence would spark a political revolution, that his name would be remembered as a savior rather than a murderer. but the world saw him for what he was, a cold-blooded extremist who slaughtered innocent children to feed his delusion. The survivors would later recall the unbearable silence that followed his arrest, an island littered with bodies, phones still ringing beside their owners, and the echo of gunshots fading into the night. During his trial, Breivik showed no remorse. He smiled, raised his fist in a Nazi salute, and insisted that his actions were necessary. He claimed to represent a secret European organization fighting against Islam and multiculturalism, though investigators found no evidence such a group existed. Psychiatric evaluations divided experts. Was he insane or simply evil? The first report diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia. A second concluded he was fully sane and accountable for his actions. Ultimately, the court agreed with the latter. On August 24, 2012, Anders Behring Breivik was sentenced to 21 years in prison, the maximum penalty under Norwegian law, with the possibility of indefinite extension if deemed a continued threat. It was a sentence that reflected Norway's deep commitment to justice and rehabilitation, even in the face of unimaginable cruelty. In prison, Breivik lived in isolation, but continued to seek attention. He filed lawsuits over his conditions, claiming his rights were violated because he couldn't use a computer freely or communicate with supporters. He even changed his name to Fjotolf Hansen, insisting he was a political prisoner. The irony of a man who silenced so many young voices demanding sympathy for his own situation was not lost on the public. Survivors and families of victims found his continued presence in the news painful, but they also refused to let his ideology define their country. Norway responded to terror with compassion, rebuilding not only its damaged buildings, but also its sense of unity. Each year, ceremonies on July 22nd honor the victims of both the Oslo bombing and the Utøya massacre. Photos of smiling teenagers, dreamers, activists, friends serve as a stark reminder of what was lost. Their parents speak softly of empty chairs at dinner tables, of birthdays that never came. But they also speak of resilience. They built memorials not only of stone, but of kindness, refusing to let hatred win. Breivik's actions were meant to divide, yet they did the opposite. They brought Norwegians closer together, determined to protect the values he tried to destroy. In the end, Anders Behring Breivik will likely spend the rest of his life in confinement, his dreams of igniting a revolution reduced to silence within concrete walls. His manifesto has faded into obscurity, but the names of those he killed remain engraved in the heart of Norway. Evil wanted attention. Instead, it gave rise to unity. That is perhaps the deepest irony of all, that one man's hatred became the catalyst for a nation's compassion. James Holmes. James Egan Holmes was born on December 13, 1987, in San Diego, California, the only son of a mathematician father and a registered nurse mother, raised alongside a younger sister in an environment that, by all outward appearances, was stable and nurturing. His early life, however, hinted at the shadows that would later define his existence. Holmes's family moved frequently, from Oak Hills to the affluent Rancho Peñasquitos neighborhood, and during his adolescent years, he began to withdraw socially. Teachers and family members noted a boy who struggled to connect, whose mind seemed often elsewhere, and who carried with him an undercurrent of fear and fascination with death. According to Holmes himself, he was haunted by what he called nail ghosts, nocturnal phantoms hammering on the walls, a childhood terror that foreshadowed a deeper psychological unease. By the age of 11, he had already attempted suicide, an early indicator of the depression and violent ideation that would later define his mental state. Despite these challenges, Holmes excelled academically, graduating from Westview High School in 2006 and later earning a bachelor's degree in neuroscience from the University of California, Riverside, with highest honors. His academic prowess was undeniable. He scored in the 98th percentile on the verbal portion of the GRE and maintained a 3.949 GPA, and yet his brilliance coexisted with a growing isolation and obsessive thoughts of death and violence. Holmes's intellect opened doors to elite graduate programs, and in 2011, he moved to Aurora, Colorado, to pursue a PhD in neuroscience at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus. It was here, amidst the quiet of student life and the anonymity of a new city, that his plans began to crystallize. He lived in a one-bedroom apartment on Paris Street, describing himself as quiet and easygoing, leaving behind digital traces through a MySpace account, an online dating profile, and a resume uploaded to Monster.com. But in reality, he cultivated a meticulous internal world of fantasy and preparation. Holmes's interactions with others were sporadic and strained. He briefly dated a fellow student in his biology class, but their relationship faltered, with his partner recalling episodes of deadpan humor and expressions of violent desire. This breakup, Holmes later claimed, deepened his depression and contributed to the homicidal obsessions that would come to dominate his thinking. By the summer of 2012, Holmes's academic performance had declined, and he withdrew from the University of Colorado, leaving a void that was filled by planning and fixation. Holmes's fascination with weapons and tactics intensified. Between May and June of 2012, he legally purchased a Glock 22 pistol, a Remington 870 Express tactical shotgun, and a Smith & Wesson M&P 15 sport rifle. Alongside these firearms, he acquired thousands of rounds of ammunition and tactical gear, including a Blackhawk urban assault vest, magazine holders, a knife, and spike strips, the latter intended to slow law enforcement in the event of pursuit. He researched mass killing extensively, contemplating locations, timing, and methods, ultimately choosing the Century 16 Theater in Aurora, reasoning that a midnight screening would limit the presence of children, and that the theater's locked doors would maximize casualties while delaying police response. Holmes meticulously booby-trapped his apartment with explosives, intending to create additional chaos and ensure his plans could unfold without interruption. Despite his meticulous preparation, he displayed contradictory behavior. Hours before the shooting, he mailed a notebook to his psychiatrist, detailing his thoughts and planning, and even called a mental health crisis line, a brief attempt at seeking intervention that was disconnected within seconds. On July 20, 2012, Holmes executed his plan. He propped open an exit door to gain access, set off smoke or gas canisters, and opened fire on the unsuspecting audience. Within minutes, 12 people were dead, and 70 others were wounded. Law enforcement apprehended Holmes moments later, calm and detached, standing beside his car. During the arrest, he disclosed the booby-trapped explosives in his apartment, which were later confirmed by police. In the aftermath, the focus shifted to the courtroom. Holmes was detained at Arapahoe Detention Center under suicide watch, isolated from other inmates due to the high-profile nature of his crimes. He made his first appearance in Centennial, Colorado, where his blank stare and lack of engagement fueled speculation about his mental state. Formal charges followed, eventually totaling 152 counts, including 24 first-degree murders, 116 attempted murders, and possession of explosives. The case drew national attention, in part because of the complexity of the mental health defense Holmes's attorneys mounted. His legal team argued that he suffered from severe mental illness, including schizotypal personality disorder and schizoaffective disorder, rendering him incapable of understanding the consequences of his actions. The prosecution countered, presenting evidence that Holmes meticulously planned the attack, purchased weapons legally, and executed the massacre with deliberate intent. Jury selection was a monumental task, lasting 3 months and involving 9,000 candidates, the largest summons in U.S. history. Particular care was taken to avoid jurors with ties to prior mass shootings, though 2 had personal connections to the Columbine tragedy. The trial began on April 27, 2015. Prosecution witnesses recounted the horror of the Aurora Theater that night, detailing survivors' injuries and the chaos that ensued. Crucial evidence included Holmes's notebook, which outlined attack plans and served as a tangible link between his thoughts and actions. Court-appointed psychiatrists testified that while Holmes suffered from mental illness, he was legally sane and capable of forming intent. Video recordings from interviews and jail behavior further painted a portrait of a man deeply troubled, yet cognizant of his actions, from paranoid delusions to social isolation, from violent fantasies to calculated execution. Closing arguments emphasized the scale of the tragedy and the premeditation behind it, while the defense underscored Holmes's mental health struggles and appeals for clemency. On July 16, 2015, after over 12 hours of deliberation, the jury found Holmes guilty on all counts. Sentencing deliberations followed, during which jurors considered aggravating factors such as cruelty, ambush, and lying in wait, weighed against mitigating circumstances, including mental illness. Holmes's family testified, with his father pleading for his life, emphasizing his son's long-standing psychological struggles. Ultimately, the jury failed to reach unanimity on the death penalty, and on August 26, 2015, Judge Carlos Samor sentenced Holmes to 12 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 3,318 years for attempted murder and explosives charges, declaring it the court's intention that Holmes never set foot in free society again. Further restitution orders required Holmes to pay $955,000 to victims, partially through the State Victim Compensation Fund. Adam Lanza. On the morning of December 14, 2012, the quiet town of Newtown, Connecticut, awoke to what would become one of the darkest days in American history. Adam Lanza, a 20-year-old living with his mother, began his day by taking her life in their home, a cold act that prefaced a horror yet to unfold. Nancy Lanza, 52, lay in her bed, clad in pajamas, 4 bullets to her head, while the life of her son, a man deeply isolated and enmeshed in his own dark obsessions, propelled him toward a school where innocence awaited. By 9:30 a.m., Sandy Hook Elementary had locked its doors, a routine meant to protect, not forewarn of the chaos about to erupt. Adam, armed with his mother's Bushmaster XM15 E2S rifle and 10 30-round magazines, forced his way through a glass panel at the entrance, clad in black, yellow earplugs shielding him from the sound of his own destruction, sunglasses hiding his eyes, a vest holding the instruments of devastation. The first shots rang out, heard faintly over the morning intercom, a sound misidentified by faculty initially as some mechanical disturbance. Principal Dawn Hochsprung, school psychologist Mary Sherlock, and lead teacher Natalie Hammond confronted him in the hall, their courage a fragile barrier between life and death. Both Hochsprung and Sherlock were shot dead immediately, Hammond wounded but surviving, pressed against a conference room door to keep herself alive. Elsewhere, children huddled in closets and bathrooms, the terror punctuated by gunfire, a cacophony of screams and commands. "Put your hands up," echoed by a voice that would offer no mercy. In room 8, teacher Lauren Rousseau attempted to hide her first graders in a bathroom. 15 children, along with Rousseau and behavioral therapist Rachel Davino, were shot, 14 dying instantly, 1 taken to a hospital and later pronounced dead. In room 10, Victoria Lee Soto and Anne-Marie Murphy, protecting their students, were gunned down alongside the children they shielded. Jesse Lewis, a 6-year-old, shouted for his friends to escape, yet was killed in the attempt. Survivors would later recount the moments of silence, the chilling presence of a young man systematically extinguishing life, moving through the school with a methodical precision that suggested planning far beyond impulse. Some children survived by hiding beneath desks or barricading themselves in closets. Caitlin Roig, another teacher, shielded 15 students behind a bathroom door, her quiet instructions becoming a lifeline. Yvonne Tech and Marianne Jacob corralled 18 children into a storage room when a library door failed to lock, holding the makeshift barricade against fear and reality. Outside, law enforcement received the first 911 call at 9:35 a.m. Newtown police arrived minutes later, followed by the Connecticut State Police, entering the school only after the last shot was fired at 9:40 a.m. Lanza had ended his own life in classroom 10, his body discovered clad in black, a green vest draped over his form, firearms abandoned around him, including a jammed Glock and a Sig Sauer that never fired. In less than 5 minutes, 156 shots had been fired, leaving 26 dead, including 20 children, 6 staff members, and Lanza's mother. Investigators found no suicide note, no explanation, only a trail of evidence painting a picture of a young man obsessed with mass shootings, with a meticulous spreadsheet of 500 previous killers, clippings from other school massacres, videos of gunshot suicides, and writings exploring violence and control. Lanza had Asperger's syndrome, obsessive-compulsive disorder, depression, anxiety, and possibly anorexia. But experts agreed these conditions alone did not cause the massacre. Rather, a combination of isolation, mental deterioration, preoccupation with violence, and access to firearms culminated in the ultimate act of destruction. Reports from the Office of the Child Advocate outlined the trajectory of Lanza's life. A boy increasingly withdrawn, homebound, largely unsupervised in his final years, obsessed with violent media and online communities that reinforced his dark fascinations, ultimately living in an alternate universe, disconnected from human empathy. Legal proceedings followed, with families suing the town for inadequate security and the estate of Nancy Lanza for failing to secure her weapons, resulting in partial settlements. Additional lawsuits targeted Remington and Bushmaster, alleging the military-style rifle used was unsuited for civilian ownership. The massacre prompted national debate over gun laws, mental health awareness, and school safety. Yet the question of why Lanza targeted Sandy Hook remains unresolved. Survivors, families, and first responders continue to grapple with the trauma, preserving memories of those lost, and the courage shown by teachers and staff who confronted death to protect their students. The massacre stands as a stark reminder of the fragility of innocence, the consequences of isolation and untreated mental illness, and the lethal combination of obsession and access to weapons. Elliot Rodger. Elliot Oliver Robertson. Rodger was born on July 24, 1991, in London, England, into a life that seemed outwardly privileged, but concealed fractures that would later define his path. The son of British filmmaker Peter Rodger and Malaysian-Chinese mother Lee Chin, Elliot grew up amidst affluence, moving from London to the upscale neighborhood of Woodland Hills in Los Angeles as a child. Despite the apparent advantages, his early life was marked by isolation, social awkwardness, and a growing sense of alienation. Diagnosed in adolescence with PDD-NOS, a form of autism spectrum disorder, Rodger struggled with communication, social interactions, and sensory overstimulation, making ordinary school and peer experiences deeply challenging. He endured bullying, exclusion, and a persistent sense of being different, all of which fed a simmering resentment toward those around him. Even as a child, moments that should have brought joy, like Disneyland trips or school parties, became overwhelming, leaving him anxious and frustrated. His relationship with his sister, complicated by rivalry and parental attention, added to a sense of personal inadequacy that would haunt him into adulthood. Rodger's adolescence was a mix of attempts at social integration and repeated setbacks. His mother's connections in Hollywood allowed him glimpses of glamour, from red carpet premieres to exclusive concerts. But these experiences only amplified his awareness of what he could not attain: meaningful connections with peers, particularly women. At school, he was ostracized, labeled weird or quiet, and repeatedly subjected to bullying that reinforced his view of the world as hostile. Even when he tried to engage socially, whether by changing his appearance or seeking popular peers, his efforts were met with rejection. Compounding these challenges were physical insecurities, his short height, and mixed-race heritage, which he felt made him stand apart from predominantly white peer groups. Video games and online forums became his sanctuary, offering a controlled space where he could engage with others on his terms. Here, he began to encounter ideas and communities that would later radicalize him, particularly forums where men discussed their frustrations at being involuntarily celibate. By his late teens, Rodger's mental health treatment had largely ceased. He withdrew from prescribed medications and therapy, preferring to rely on positive thinking to manage his social anxiety. He blamed his parents for his lack of romantic success and personal fulfillment, interpreting their decisions and financial limitations as obstacles deliberately placed in his path. His time in college only heightened his envy and frustration. At Los Angeles Pierce College and later Moorpark College, he fixated on couples around him, observing what he perceived as undeserved attention and romantic success. Social rejection, particularly by women he desired, compounded his anger, shaping a worldview steeped in misogyny and entitlement. Rodger moved to Isla Vista, California in 2011, hoping a change of environment might finally allow him to find companionship and status. He enrolled in Santa Barbara City College and secured an apartment near the University of California, Santa Barbara campus. Instead of alleviating his isolation, the move intensified it. Rodger became increasingly fixated on blonde women, blaming them and men more socially adept than himself for his lack of sexual experience. He began to obsessively plan a day of retribution, envisioning a violent purge aimed at punishing women who rejected him and men he considered rivals. He purchased firearms, practiced at shooting ranges, and meticulously plotted the murders he would commit, all while documenting his grievances in a 137-page manifesto titled My Twisted World: The Story of Elliot Rodger. In it, he described a life marred by rejection, his anger toward women, and fantasies of domination, control, and mass violence. Rodger's writings reveal a disturbing mindset. He viewed women as a plague, argued that men of intelligence should dictate their sexual choices, and imagined himself leading a world reshaped by fear and obedience. Rodger's online activity mirrored his private obsessions. He posted videos on YouTube documenting his loneliness, frustration, and resentment, with titles such as, "Why Do Girls Hate Me So Much?" and "Life is So Unfair Because Girls Don't Want Me." He shared images of himself in luxury, often alongside his BMW and designer clothing, hoping to attract female attention that never came. He engaged in forums tied to the incel community, where he discussed his virginity, expressed misogynistic views, and praised other mass killers. His internet presence amplified his sense of entitlement and reinforced his extremist ideologies, turning his isolation into a spiral of hatred and planning. The week leading up to May 23, 2014, saw Rodger upload 22 videos to YouTube, each reflecting his obsession with social rejection and his intention to punish those he felt had wronged him. His preparations were precise. He divided his plan into phases, first killing his roommates and a friend in his apartment, then targeting the Alpha Phi sorority house, and finally carrying out a rampage through Isla Vista using both firearms and his vehicle. In these videos, Rodger was calm, articulate, and methodical, framing his forthcoming massacre as a calculated act of retribution, not a spontaneous crime of passion. On the morning of May 23rd, Rodger began his deadly rampage. He first murdered his roommates and their friend in the apartment they shared, stabbing each as they arrived. Hours later, he attempted to attack the Alpha Phi sorority house, but failing to gain entry, redirected his violence toward 3 women walking nearby, shooting and killing 2 while critically wounding the third. He then drove through Isla Vista, indiscriminately shooting and ramming pedestrians, ultimately killing a man in a delicatessen. Law enforcement engaged him twice in gunfire, and he sustained a gunshot wound to the hip before finally crashing his vehicle. Rodger died at the scene from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head, bringing a horrifying day of calculated violence to an end. Dylann Storm Roof. Dylann Storm Roof was born on April 3, 1994, in Columbia, South Carolina, to Franklin Bennett Roof, a carpenter and construction contractor, and Amelia Amy Cowles, a bartender. His parents' relationship was turbulent, marked by a divorce shortly after his birth, though they briefly reconciled. Roof's early years were shaped by instability and dysfunction. His father, later remarried to Paige Mann, was verbally and physically abusive, a shadow that would linger over Roof's childhood. Moving intermittently between homes in South Carolina and a brief period in the Florida Keys, Roof's upbringing was inconsistent, fragmented, and often lonely. Behavioral issues emerged early. Obsessive-compulsive tendencies, strict grooming rituals, and a fixation on cleanliness became hallmarks of his personality. By middle school, he had already started experimenting with marijuana, and over 9 years, he attended at least 7 different schools, repeating the 9th grade and ultimately dropping out by 2010. Roof's days oscillated between playing video games and abusing substances, isolated from the structure of school and routine. Though he had some African American friends, his worldview was quietly brewing with the seeds of hatred that would later explode into violence. In the years leading up to June 17, 2015, Roof's interactions with the law were limited, but increasingly concerning. In February of that year, mall security alerted authorities after Roof, dressed entirely in black, asked employees unsettling questions. A search revealed strips of buprenorphine, naloxone, prescription medication he did not possess legally, leading to a misdemeanor drug charge. This minor infraction would later emerge as a missed opportunity to prevent a far greater tragedy. Weeks later, police found in his car a forearm grip and multiple unloaded magazines capable of holding 40 rounds. Though the items were legal to possess in South Carolina, it marked a disturbing step toward preparation for mass violence. Roof's final warning came in April 2015, when he was arrested for trespassing at the Columbiana Center Mall, violating an earlier ban. Yet none of these encounters diverted him from the path he had already chosen. Roof's descent into extremist ideology was deliberate, self-radicalized through the dark corners of the internet. Online, he constructed an identity steeped in white supremacy and neo-Nazism. 3 days after the Charleston massacre, authorities discovered a website registered to Roof, the Last Rhodesian, where he posted photos posing with Confederate symbols, Nazi code numbers, and firearms. The website also contained a manifesto, a chilling exposition of his worldview. Roof's writing revealed an obsession with black-on-white crime and a desire to incite racial warfare. He cited the deaths of Trayvon Martin and Freddie Gray as formative events that, in his mind, justified violence. The manifesto read like a calculated blueprint for terror. Roof meticulously outlined his hatred for African Americans, Jews, Hispanics, and other groups, framing the Charleston church as a target both symbolic and strategic. He wrote, "I chose Charleston because it is the most historic city in my state, and at one time had the highest ratio of blacks to whites in the country." Roof believed himself the reluctant hero of a cause rooted in delusion, convinced that the massacre he was about to commit would ignite a race war he longed to see. On the evening of June 17, 2015, Roof arrived at Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, a historic sanctuary in downtown Charleston, South Carolina. Inside, a Bible study was underway, led by senior pastor and state senator Clementa C. Pinckney. Roof, a young man of 21, armed and calculated, entered the room and opened fire. 9 people were killed, including Pinckney, and a 10th was injured. His attack was swift, methodical, and indiscriminate, carried out with a detached calm that would later horrify investigators and the nation alike. Friends and family of Roof's victims later recalled the horrifying scene. The smell of gunpowder, the shocked silence, the chaos of fleeing congregants. Roof had achieved the unimaginable. He had turned a sacred space into a scene of carnage. Within hours, Roof became the focal point of a nationwide manhunt. His photo circulated across the media and tips flooded in. By the morning of June 18th, Roof was apprehended in Shelby, North Carolina, 245 miles from Charleston. A motorist recognized him, tracking his vehicle for miles until police could intervene. Roof was cooperative during arrest, though he reportedly expressed disbelief at the true death toll, stating he had felt bad but had underestimated the number of victims. The investigation quickly revealed that Roof had spent months planning the attack, researching the church's history, and compiling lists of potential targets. Despite his social isolation and the fact that he had few in-person extremist contacts, Roof's digital footprint revealed a self-made ideology of hate, meticulously nurtured online. The legal proceedings that followed were unprecedented. Roof was charged in both state and federal court, facing a combination of murder and hate crime charges that could, and ultimately did, carry the death penalty. In federal court, he was tried on 33 charges, including civil rights violations and firearm offenses, and became the first person in U.S. history to face the death penalty for both federal and state crimes simultaneously. In December 2016, the federal jury found him guilty on all counts, and by January 11, 2017, he was sentenced to death. In state court, Roof accepted a plea deal to avoid a second death sentence, receiving 9 consecutive life sentences without parole for the murders in Charleston. Throughout his trials, Roof remained largely unrepentant, even at times representing himself to prevent his lawyers from presenting evidence of potential mental illness that could mitigate his culpability. Psychiatric evaluations noted social anxiety, possible autistic traits, depression, and a schizoid personality disorder. Yet Roof's motivations remained firmly rooted in racial hatred rather than mental incapacity. Roof's incarceration has been marked by relative isolation and occasional violence. In August 2016, he was beaten by a fellow inmate while detained at Charleston County Jail, suffering bruises but no long-term injury. He was transferred to USP Terre Haute, the federal death row for men, where he remains. His appeals, focused largely on claims of mental illness and competency, have been consistently rejected. Federal authorities have made clear that unlike some other inmates, whose death sentences were commuted, Roof remained slated for execution due to the unique gravity and hate-driven nature of his crimes.